Russia has to somehow be pushed or at least convinced to enter a post-geographic global political economy, right? And to start thinking hard about diversifying its economy in order to survive.
That was Francesco Femia from Washington, D.C. I am Raul Kazan, and you are listening to a podcast hotter by 2 degrees Celsius. Francesco, or Frank Femia, is co-founder and research director at the Center for Climate and Security and at the Council on Strategic Risks, as well as co-founder and senior advisor at the IMCCS, that stands for International Military Council on Climate and Security. He is a notorious commentator on how national security of America and its allies, defense and intelligence communities address climate change-related threats. Recently, Frank and Caitlin Werrell, his wife, contributed to a book edited by SciencesPo in Paris, France, and titled The Hot War: Strategic Issues of Climate Change, with a chapter dedicated to security and climate in the East Mediterranean. Our conversation, however, revolved around Russia's failure as a Petro-State and its invasion of Ukraine and, well, consequently, war crimes, genocide, destruction, environmental disasters, and food crises. Well, the issues of the day. Francesco, it's nice to talk to you.
Nice to talk to you.
We got some history back together. In 2014, you guys came out with a really interesting study, and that study was about the climatic causes of the refugee crisis from Syria. Would you remind us about it a little bit?
Sure, yeah, happy to. Well, not happy to. I mean, it's a tragic story, but actually going even further back to 2012, this research actually came about by accident. We were looking at the Mediterranean basin and the decline in precipitation since the early 70s in the basin due to, in part, to climate change, in large part to climate change. And we noticed from looking at a NOAA map showing that decline that Syria was bright red. And usually when you see one of these maps on precipitation, bright red is a bad thing. It's not good. So we noticed that Syria had actually experienced some of the most dramatic precipitation decline in the winter, which, if you know the region or if you don't, it gets all of its rain most of its rain in the winter, and all this precipitation decline was happening in the winter. And so we started looking into it a bit further, and we found that from 2007 to 2010, Syria experienced a very extreme drought, which contributed to massive displacement. Contributed to, I say, because also there were policies by the Assad regime, whether it was agricultural policies, also irrigation practices that were encouraged by the Assad regime, that also contributed to the collapse of agriculture in Syria and also the collapse of a lot of rangeland amongst herders. Basically people herding animals for their livelihoods. And especially in the north, but also in the south, we saw major displacements of peoples related to agricultural devastation and livestock devastation. And so what we ended up with, as the UN estimated, that over 2 million Syrians may have been displaced during this time period, which contributed to kind of an atmosphere of unrest within Syria. And at the time, if you think back, the Arab Spring was happening right around 2010 and 11, and Syria was expected to be one of the more stable states in the region. And actually the U.S. State Department, around the time after Egypt and Libya and Tunisia had experienced their own revolutions, did a quick analysis and determined that Saudi Arabia and Syria were the most stable states in the region. Of course, that wasn't the case, and I think in part we missed that vulnerability in Syria because we weren't really looking at this drought driver of displacement, and also agricultural policies from the Assad regime that were helping drive that displacement of people, and we weren't fully aware of how unstable the situation was. So we've called it in some of our work a kind of a brittle state, sort of a Potemkin village state in a way that seemed stable on the outside, but there were some serious environmental vulnerabilities under the surface, which contributed to the displacement of peoples and ultimately to the conflict. I do want to say, though, of course, climate change didn't cause the conflict. There are historical grievances. There were the dynamics of the Arab Spring, wherein populations started to fear their leaders less, and sort of opened the floodgates. And so they were, the Syria was also influenced by what was happening elsewhere in the region. But climate change was a part of that dynamic and a part of the extreme drought that happened in Syria, and which ultimately contributed to the conflict, which ultimately contributed to the humanitarian disaster that we saw in Syria and that we continue to see today. So yeah, I mean the migration crisis into Europe in part has a climate dimension to it, not caused by climate, but climate change is part of the background, and it's really important to understand that from when we're looking to the future, because we're looking at more precipitation decline in North Africa and the Middle East, on top of an already volatile political situation. So we have to be prepared for that. And if we're not doing something about it in advance, we're just going to see more and more of these kinds of disasters. So.
Well, this crisis eventually led to the intervention of the Russian army in Syria, and this is like bringing us close to the crisis that we're facing today in Europe, which is basically a war in Ukraine, which is invaded by the Russian occupier. And do you see any similarities, or do you research it in any way at the Center for Climate and Security?
Yeah, I mean, so there's it's a different situation in the sense that we haven't done any analysis to show that this particular conflict is driven by climate change in any way. In an approximate way, this conflict is driven by the decision by the Russian government to invade Ukraine for a number of reasons, many of which are dubious, right? And so that's what's causing this conflict in Ukraine in the most direct sense, right? Putin decided that he wanted to prevent Ukraine from being some kind of a perceived threat to Russia, and decided to invade the country in the most brutal way possible. And so that's I think it's important to ground it in the fact that we have a Russian leader who decided to invade Ukraine for a number of ideological reasons. And I think it's important to understand that. But it's also important to understand that there's a weakness that Russia has exploited related to dependence on fossil fuels within Europe, and particularly within Europe, that may have contributed to Putin feeling like he would not lose too much economically and even potentially politically by making this territorial move, right? By invading Ukraine, likely, and we understand this from analysts who've been watching Putin for a while, likely felt that Western Europe and the Eastern European nations that are within the European Union weren't strong enough economically because of their dependence on Russian gas and oil, and also nuclear imports as well from Russia, weren't strong enough to punish or to enact the kinds of punishments that they've decided to levy against Russia. And so it's really important to understand that, because were Western Europe less dependent on Russian energy, I think there's an argument to be made that perhaps Putin would have made a different decision, right, about the level of pain that Russia might bring upon itself economically and politically, and maybe that would have prevented Russia from invading Ukraine in the first place. So that's a hypothetical, right? We don't know if that's true, but it's important when thinking about the absolute necessity of reducing dependence on Russian energy in the future. I think another thing, though, related to some research that my colleagues Aaron Sikorsky and co-authors did, is implications, right, on food security as a result of this. Of course, Ukraine is, I think a lot of us know now that is a breadbasket in a lot of ways, just given the wheat grown in the country. Ukraine is a major exporter also of wheat onto the global food market, as is Russia. And so while it's hard to make the argument, well, Russia, wanted more wheat and so invaded Ukraine, that's a very simplistic thing to say. I don't think that actually has much to do with the reasons behind the invasion. But the implications for food security, as we've recently seen, are huge.
And you think this might lead to a scenario similar to the one in Syria that you guys researched?
Sure. If you look at dependence on wheat, right, there are a number of countries that depend on the global food market for their wheat, not only, globally, and also in places where growing wheat is very difficult and water intensive, including in the Middle East, in North Africa. Some of the most wheat dependent countries actually are in the Middle East and North Africa, but also in other parts of the world. And so the implications for food security are massive. And the price of wheat, the availability of wheat, etc., globally, going down dramatically as a result of this war, are already being felt, and has already been, as many have said, including from the World Food Program and elsewhere, that this is already causing a major global food security crisis. We can't even get this is such a big, potentially catastrophic problem of food security that even predicting the implications for conflict and security and instability around the world is incredibly difficult. But what we can say, I think, I can say it because I'm talking, but I think the implications could be pretty profound. And if we look at, if past this prologue at least a little bit, when we had these shocks, to wheat in the past, and we had shocks to wheat in 2010 also in Russia with some heat waves, and then Russia banned the export of wheat, for example. Even that caused the price of wheat, or at least was a major contributor to the price of wheat going up 300% in Egypt, for example. And this was right around the time that there were protests in Tahrir Square, etc. In the rural areas, there were protests around the price of wheat because they went up 300%, in part because of this decision by Russia to cut exports off because of a drought in Russia. So all these connections, led to that happening. And at the time, the Mubarak regime in Egypt was saying, well, this is just an elite revolution. A bunch of Western-educated liberals in Tahrir Square. It has nothing to do with real Egyptians out in the country. But this wasn't true. There were 3 areas of Egypt which were experiencing these protests around wheat prices, who were very upset with the Mubarak government. And so, and I use that example because this relatively small shock, and I say relatively small compared to the shock to the global food market now and the shock to wheat supply now, helped contribute to a very significant political problem in Egypt. And so I think this could be catastrophic in a lot of ways, both not just for political instability, but on a humanitarian level. We're going to see a lot of people die globally because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what that's done to the global wheat market. And so as if we needed another thing to blame Russia for, I think we can very clearly blame the Russian government for creating what could potentially be one of the most significant global food security crises that I've seen in my lifetime. So.
Mm-hmm. But coming back to energy policies and the whole energy market in not only in Europe but in the world altogether, I don't see, at least from what I'm reading recently, and even way before the conflict, I don't see any future for Russia. Really, I'm not joking. This started basically, weaning yourself as a country, either in Europe or elsewhere, from the Russian fossil fuels, was the actual way to go. And Russians actually felt it because there was nothing in there for them. Why? Well, that's because probably, as I see, and by the way, it's an amazing book written by Amy Myers Jaffe about energy's digital future. And energy in the future, obviously, it's not going to be, just dig for oil or dig for gas and just sell it as it is. It's going to be way smarter than that.
Yeah.
Way smarter regulation and everything like that, So basically, I mean, even the position of your organization sounds something like this. I think Erin Sikorsky said it. It says that there's a lot of concern about dependence on Russian natural gas, as whether that inhibits countries' ability to stand up to Russia. And the more that these countries wean themselves off oil and gas and move towards renewables, the more independence they have in terms of action.
Yes.
And I think this conflict is also about that. I mean, in the background, we're talking about this.
Absolutely.
It's not that bullshit and mumbo jumbo about, Greater Russia and all that stuff.
It's definitely also about this. And it's a little bit frustrating. It's like the movie Don't Look Up, where you feel like a Cassandra, that you've been shouting about these things for so long, and it actually, in recent conversations with you and your partner, we've discussed how countries in Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltic states have been shouting about some of these issues for a long time, in terms of the over dependence of Europe on Russian fossil fuels, gas, oil, and even on nuclear. I mentioned before, even on nuclear imports, there's that dynamic too, which creates a dependence, and it's frustrating because it's come. Yes, of course, there have been serious attempts to wean Europe off of this dependence on Russia, but they haven't been serious enough, and it's a tragedy that it has taken a humanitarian disaster and a war of this scale to really wake up Western Europe to this problem. And as I was saying before, I think you can make sort of an argument that's difficult to prove, but I think you can say it with some certainty that had Europe been a lot more foresighted about weaning ourselves off of Russian dependence earlier, thinking of it strategically, from a strategic perspective. And we've always thought of, as an organization too, as investments in renewable energy and also in adaptation, climate adaptation, for example, as being a strategic imperative. And I think in the U.S. we've thought about it for a while that way too. Were there to have been more strategic thinking about that importance, I think we would have been in a better place. And I think there was some maybe Pollyannish thinking about the intentions of the Russian government over time, and this perception that Russia would soften its territorial ambitions over time, and that wouldn't be heavy-handed with its use of that leverage. And I think that's unfortunate. But yeah, absolutely, this is about that. And if Western Europe doesn't wean itself off of dependence on Russian oil, gas, etc., after now, then that's a serious problem. And I know right now there are obvious serious attempts to do that, but also there's some cracks in that, right? Still, already we're hearing about some of the political difficulties that that certain countries think they're facing. We're seeing political forces in certain countries, including in France and in Hungary, etc., who are exploiting the concern for the consumer. And also in Germany, that may be resulting from this decision to stand up to Russia. And so, but I think we need to stand strong and say, okay, renewable energy investments, massive ones that will wean us off of fossil fuels in Europe and elsewhere, are incredibly important for slowing down climate change and avoiding a world of 2 degrees Celsius that will be its own security disaster, but also for the very traditional strategic imperative of not being dependent on a Russia that's acting like a 19th century power, right? So I think, yeah, it's definitely also, like you said, also about this. And Erin Sikorsky is absolutely right.
But here it is. I mean, this is obviously a European problem mostly because, well, Western Europe altogether is at this point dependent on Russian fossil fuels. But what can you guys in America do about this? And I have a comment here. I think, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of a lot of smart people, they say that geography belongs kind of to the oil age, to an old oil age, an age of where access to crude oil was distributed and is distributed unevenly all around the world. And this is basically leading to anxieties. These anxieties are related to access and transports of fossil fuels, and this leads to crises and stuff like this. And today, however, you need to focus, and this is what America does recently, to the ability to finance, to deploy, operate smart electricity infrastructures, automated vehicles, new markets and new consumers, this is happening most especially in a world which is concerned with climate change. So you have environmental gains in all this, And in my opinion, the United States knew this already, and they realized that American government altogether, right, realized that it needed more innovation in terms of energy, technology, deployment, in manufacturing. And something incredible from my perspective happened 2 years ago. So that was early 2020, if I'm not wrong, when the US came up with the Energy Innovation Act. So it's 2020, right? So this is like the legal foundation for such a consensus that this consensus is actually bipartisan, and because it was Democratic, Republican at the same time. Of course, they differ on many aspects, but altogether, the fact that they have to innovate and this consensus for smarter energy is there. It's just that the Trump administration actually failed in the sense that it focused on deploying more and more fossil fuels and make America dominant here only with this, and not only with new, greater innovation in terms of like cleaner energy. You have comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is sort of a bipartisan consensus, I think, in the U.S., at least amongst the current makeup of the, of the U.S. Congress, that there is a strategic reason for the U.S. to make significant investments in clean energy and renewable energy. Where there's less of a consensus, I think, is how quickly that needs to happen, and what mechanisms need to be used to incentivize that, right? And so there's differences between the parties in the U.S. about how much government intervention there needs to be in order to level the playing field, etc. With one party in particular, favoring a policy that would take a lot longer to realize, right? And the other, stressing the urgency of the situation from a climate perspective, but also from a security perspective. From our perspective as an organization that looks at climate change and energy issues from a security perspective, and to explain what that means, we, for example, a lot of our analysts and those on our board, etc., they look at climate and environmental issues from experience in the security community, whether it's in the military world, the intelligence community, etc., as more so than just as an environmental issue, right? So we everything we do has that lens of, okay, what are the security consequences of climate, and also what are the security consequences and benefits of investments in dealing with climate, right? Either with energy investments or even on adaptation. And over the past 10 years, a bit of a consensus has grown around, okay, this is a security problem. So I think you'll definitely hear that stated, at least, that this is a security problem, and a lot of people agree with that in both parties. And then there's some disagreement on how quickly we need to do something about it, but there's a belief that led to, I think, in part, to this Energy Innovation Act in 2020, that we need to innovate for strategic reasons. But that can't just be mostly rhetoric. And I think there have been resources put towards this, etc. But from our perspective, the resources put towards innovating on energy for strategic reasons, or whatever reasons, really, do not meet the scale of the threat. Either the threat from climate change itself, or the strategic threat related to not doing so, including dependence on on fossil fuels and the threat that creates.
Right.
Your Western European dependence on Russian gas and oil, for example, that creates a threat, and other risks. And so what can the U.S. do is spend a lot more money. I mean, it's very in vogue in Washington to say, "Oh, we can do this for very little money," right? Or we can just tinker around the edges with innovation. And no. There needs to, just when you look at the scale of the threat from climate change itself, and then the need to become independent from fossil fuels for strategic reasons, this has to happen very soon, on a major scale. And we sometimes compare it to, if you look at the billions of dollars that go into preventing the detonation of a weapon of mass destruction, for example, or a number of other security issues. We should be thinking about climate change in the same way, right? We have to do this on a scale that's commensurate to the threat, and the threat is very significant to catastrophic. We put out a report a few years ago saying that if we hit a 2-degree world, 2 degrees Celsius world, would present catastrophic security problems for the world. So we're not just talking about an major environmental problem. From the perspective of a number of military intelligence and foreign policy leaders within the U.S. who participated in this assessment, we call it a security threat assessment, we are going to see catastrophic security problems at 2 degrees. So what can the U.S. do? Like I said, a lot more money has to go into rapidly investing in clean energy on a whole number of levels, both within the United States and abroad. We have to do something from a government perspective to limit the incentives for continuing to put out greenhouse gas emissions. So I think there has to be a significant role for the U.S. government to do that, also on the emission side, and then for those changes that are already baked in, because unfortunately, we're going to see changes no matter what we do. We could go to zero emissions tomorrow, and we're still going to see some pretty significant climate impacts. We need to make major investments also in adaptation, both within the U.S. but also abroad. And there's also a security dimension there, right? So as the U.S. thinks of itself as a competitor with China, or a competitor, obviously, with Russia, an adversary of Russia's, what are we doing to help countries in China's neighborhood, for example, to adapt to the changes from climate change? Very vulnerable countries in the region. China likes to present itself as the champion of the vulnerable in those countries. Well, okay, if that's the case, whether or not that's actually physically true, the U.S. should be thinking a lot about, well, how do we make significant investments in those countries and vulnerable populations for humanitarian reasons, but also, for more traditional security reasons too, right? So, like, how do we compete for influence with China in the Asia-Pacific region? Yeah. Well, in part, how about we help people more, with investments in climate adaptation? And then when you think about our adversarial relationship with Russia, how do we need to continue to present ourselves I say our, but it's born and raised in the United States, and did a lot of my work in the States, but as a as a provider of beneficial services for the globe, and in contrast to a Russia that essentially is holding the world hostage in a lot of ways, right? And also now with a very explicit and dangerous nuclear threat, right? You can't do anything. We will take this land, and you can't do anything because we have a bunch of nuclear weapons, right? Mm-hmm. This is the role Russia is playing, and I think a lot of people around the world see that. There's a lot of misinformation about that, and so not everybody is seeing it. But the U.S. needs to present, and I'd say Europe also, and also other countries around the world, and especially democracies, as providing material benefits in the face of a changing climate. And there are a lot of countries who are very, very vulnerable to climate change. Russia is quite influential in a number of African states, for example, who've been reluctant to, some of whom have been reluctant to criticize the Russian government, and we see this in India as well. Well, how do we improve our relationship with a number of these vulnerable countries? Well, there's a lot of ways to do that, but one of the ways of doing that is to invest in climate adaptation, in these places. And unfortunately, in the U.S. right now, I think there's been a pull back to isolationism. Maybe Russia's actions in Ukraine have changed that temporarily, but we've seen, in both political parties, but especially on the far right, this pushback from engaging in the world, and this neo-isolationism. And that could be a disaster, I think, on a strategic level for the United States, but also on the climate level. We can't afford right now to basically pull back and say, no, we're just going to take care of ourselves, and we're going to let everybody else deal with the consequences of this issue. That's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. And so hopefully, if people aren't convinced in the U.S. on a climate level, like we should do this just to reduce emissions, then on a strategic level, it's absolutely imperative that we make major investments. And I think it just takes a lot more than the Energy Innovation Act. It takes, I can't put a number on it, but I would say significantly more resources than what, I think flow from that. And it can't just be, well, we're going to invest in R&D, et cetera. We have to level the playing field much more, make it easier, and cheaper to develop this energy infrastructure needed for clean energy, et cetera. And then we have to work out the details of how to do that in a way that's strategically beneficial. And so, I don't know, there's a lot the U.S. can do. I could go on forever, and I'll stop here.
Well, this new sort of Monroe Doctrine that kind of was embraced by the Trump administration previously, it's a little bit schizophrenic in the sense that okay, America invested and innovated a lot in fossil fuels, which is great as in terms of innovation strictly. In terms of climate, it's a disaster. Having all these brand new sources of both oil and gas and everything. However, on the global market, they basically put Russia with their backs on the wall, with their back on the wall, really. And that was, these were the years, the moments when both Russia and Iran, for that matter, became bullies, like serious bullies. They became more militarized. Their, discourse became the discourse of a military power and so on and so forth. They literally became bullies. And it was probably a matter of time that they were getting even angrier, because what I'm trying to see right here is not only, the Russian territorial or geographical issues that they have, because I believe geography is not that much of an issue anymore, especially with Russia. It's a matter that Russia on the long term stands on a pretty shaky ground, economically speaking.
Yeah, and I think Russia sees itself as still living in a geographic age, because in an era of geography, because as soon as it doesn't, then it feels weak, right? And so in a way, because Russia is essentially a Petro-State, right, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it is.
It's a Petro-State, and so its power rests on that, on being a Petro-State and on having nuclear weapons, right? And so that, and its economy is incredibly weak. And so so I guess the question would be, like, what do we, after, going forward, hopefully when this conflict is resolved, before too many people die, what do we do about this political entity that is Russia, that is a Petro-State, that sees its power as based on that, and on having, and then sees its power in geographic terms, more land, more territory still matters because of its perception of itself as a Petro-State, and that also has nuclear weapons and is freely threatening to use nuclear weapons, which is, I think, something over the past decade or so has become much more acceptable within the Russian elite, is just to say, well, we'll use nuclear weapons. That kind of saber rattling is incredibly dangerous on a number of levels, and the U.S. essentially doesn't do that, So, but what do we do about this entity? And so, like you said, is there a perception amongst the Russian elite that their backs up against the wall? They're historical losers unless they act the way they're acting, in order to be seen and heard and understood as a power? That's a really difficult and a really excellent question that, honestly, legions of students should be working on right now, and maybe they are, to answer, right? But a big part of the answer, from my view, is that Russia has to somehow be pushed, or at least convinced, to enter a post-geographic global political economy, right? And to start thinking hard about diversifying its economy in order to survive. Because honestly, and I think there's elements in Russian society, including the Russian youth, who understand, and I think there are more that come through in these BS polls that you see, conducted in Russia. I think there's a significant portion, in particular the Russian youth, that understands, look, we're not going to be a generation. Are we going to be is our generation that leads after Putin? Are we just going to be a 19th century, geographically based power? Is this what we're going to be? We're going to die out, or we're going to destroy the world, in our as we flail, right? Is that what Russia should be? And I think there's some hope there. So I think in a way, and this goes well beyond, sort of what we do as an institution, but I think going forward, engaging, the Russian public more broadly somehow, hopefully once this political class that's in power now goes away, or even during, on the need to diversify their economy and to become a constructive global entity, right, is going to need to happen. So it goes way beyond just energy policy, climate policy, etc. But in part, I think we can make the argument around climate as well. Like, look, Russia, and look, Russian public, you're going to have some devastating permafrost loss in the north. You're going to have devastating impacts on your agricultural sector from heat waves that have increased, droughts that have increased, that have hit the Russian, wheat crop, for example. There are all kinds of, serious problems on climate. You can't be a Petro-State anymore. You just can't, even on that level. But also on this other level.
Give them more access to more hydrocarbons and to the Arctic wave.
Well, then they get more methane. yeah. But also, that would also completely. There's a bunch of Russian infrastructure on the permafrost, right? That's going to be an incredibly damaging, event when all of that permafrost starts to melt, right? And so, and all of that methane going up into the air. There has to be. And I think some Russians maybe understand this, but there has to be a lot more talk about the damaging impacts of methane as a carbon forcer. You know this, but essentially methane is a much stronger greenhouse gas, at least in the short term, than CO2 as an extreme climate forcer. I think there needs to be more education along those lines, because there are people within Russia, including in the elite, who will argue, "Oh, climate change is good for us." We're opening up, some more hydrocarbons in the north. We have a northern sea route that's opened up, so we can ship things more easily, and so we'll have influence in the Arctic. We planted the Russian flag on the seabed, the continental shelf, so we're gaining more territory. This is great, and this is some really seriously outdated, idiotic thinking, and a very short-term thinking, because the risks. Yes, there might be some tiny perceived benefits with a changing climate, right? You hear people in Canada sometimes say, "Oh, well, we're going to be able to grow more wine in Canada. This is great," right? But the risks associated with this massive change are so much greater than any perceived benefits. And I think there has to be a lot of education about that in Russia, and to Russia. But frankly, and I said this is not cynical, but I think it's realistic. With the current political forces there. In Russia, I think it's very difficult for any engagement to happen. So, I can't call for regime change, but
don't you think
Putin needs to go.
The political elite of Russia, together with the business elite that they're having, they knew, and they were seeing that slowly, very slowly, especially in the case of Germany and whatever, they were eloping, from the Petro-State that they are, and they were basically, having, we as Europeans, we have stricter carbon policies today, and hydrocarbon saving policies. They're all over Europe now. There is Fit for 55 and the EU Green Deal and all that. All these policies are shaping a greener, smarter, digitalized Europe, whereas Russia, whether they like it or not, would have a smaller and even smaller role to play.
Yes.
And it's the same on global markets as well, even with China, because China is going that way as well.
Yeah.
Differently, all right.
Yeah.
It's going that way. So what Russia has to offer at this point is just shelling cities. I don't see. They can offer this state terrorism. There's nothing they have left.
Yeah. No, but that's you're thinking medium to long term, and the current political leadership in Russia is thinking, well, this is the power we have now. And who knows what Putin is exactly thinking, but maybe he's thinking, before I go, I'm going to make a name for myself in history and I'm going to take some territory and expand the Russian, territorial, geographic. And so let me do that now. But it's incredibly short-sighted, and honestly, maybe this is a hopeful thing to say, and I hope it's not naive. But I think the simple fact that the world is changing to a greener world by necessity. These things are happening. You just mentioned what's happening in the European case. This is happening also in the United States.
Absolutely.
Slower than it should, but it's happening. And there's more of a bipartisan consensus on this issue than ever. And to dip into U.S. politics a little bit, even in Republican youth, for example, are very concerned about climate change and very pro-clean energy. So this is changing. It's changing. And we have this small bubble of a political class in Russia that is thinking, shoot, we don't really have much, any good ideas about how to compete in that world, and we don't want to be some small power in that world, we don't, and so let's do this. Let's take Ukraine. First, let's take Crimea, and in some ways it's domestic politics. I think but after Putin took Crimea for himself, right? And I'd say he did. It was something that the Russian state did. What happened to his popularity within Russia, right? So maybe there's a short-term domestic political, rationale for all this stuff in the face of a weak economy. So, I guess we have this absolutely isolated bubble of a political establishment that has no sense, or at least no respect for this long-term vision. I don't think it's sustainable. And so I think what needs to happen now is we need to limit the amount of human suffering that the Russian government can cause in Ukraine and also elsewhere. Obviously thinking about others who are very afraid in Georgia and other, neighboring states, and then hope for a change in the political dynamics within Russia, to wake up to the fact that they need to get involved in this new world. There was a couple years ago. There was the Russians finally, I think I forget if it was their national security strategy or the equivalent of the U.S. national security strategy in Russia, finally acknowledged the risk of climate change, right? And so there was this is a good sign, etc. Russia, even at the UN Security Council, who always blocks climate action at the Security Council, along with China often too. But Russia has always blocked specific action on climate at the Security Council. But when climate change was wrapped up into another resolution, for example, on Lake Chad, there was a resolution to include climate-sensitive post-conflict reconstruction in Lake Chad. Russia let it go and said, okay, well, as long as it's included in some other thing we're doing, it's fine. So there was some hope that the Russian political establishment would start to think, well, climate change is an issue, we need to think about it. But on the energy side, it's been, it's the addiction, really. It's addiction. It sounds almost like a cliche, but it's addiction to gas and oil and fossil fuels has proven quite strong. And so, but I think the argument needs to be made to the next generation of political leaders in Russia. And I have hope along those lines. But in the meantime, we need to limit the damage that Russia does and then hope for a long-term solution. Otherwise, the world is going to try to move on without Russia, right? And Russia, but there's a danger there, right? Which is that Russia will feel itself, as you said, which I think is apt, against a wall or in a corner. And as the world changes around it, its only way to get itself heard is like a spoiled child. Like, let me act up, let me do something violent, and hopefully the world will pay attention to us. And that's dangerous when you have a country, that's willing to commit mass murder, as they are in Ukraine, and also threatens to use nuclear weapons.
Joe Biden called it genocide.
Actually, genocide yesterday, yeah. And now there's evidence that. I think there's quite clear evidence of an intention, a genocidal intention, and
Absolutely.
We shouldn't be too surprised because the rhetoric of Putin and many in the national security elite around the falsity of the Ukrainian state and ethnic identity. That is a precursor to genocide, and when we look at those who've committed genocide in the past, including Milosevic. Who ethnic cleansing, genocide, and it's an attempt at genocide,
Yes.
And other even we heard this in Rwanda, and we've heard similar language about the right of a people, of an ethnic peoples, to even call themselves that. And so Putin has been questioning Ukrainian ethnicity or Ukrainian cultural identity for a long time. Oftentimes that, when it,
Actually, he's questioning the very idea, the very existence
of the Ukrainian state. Absolutely. And
with ethnicities, he wouldn't have a problem and all that.
Yeah.
As long as they're called the small Russians, is okay.
Right. Then there can be a minority, ethnicity within Russia. Okay. Yeah. But he's questioning the grounding for Ukrainian state in this idea of a Ukrainian identity, which is separate from a Russian one, and that is a
which is
red flag.
multicultural.
Which is a multicultural place too, and then also it's only started in 2014, but we haven't been talking about Tatars who were basically ethnically cleansed from Crimea, right? That's an ethnic minority that's barely talked about anymore, right? So Russia has been also committing ethnic cleansing and a version of genocide against ethnic minorities in Crimea, also I'd argue, and so we shouldn't be too surprised, and it's disappointing that the world is surprised, because there are people out there who've been saying ever since 2014 and even before that, listen. And I had a professor of mine, way back in my college days, who said to me once, and I'll never forget it, and it guides a lot of the way I think about things, is when a dictator tells you what they think and what they're going to do, believe them. Believe them, and I think we should believe what Putin says and says he's going to do, and then hopefully figure out a way to stop this kind of action in the future. And in the meantime, also deal with the climate crisis. So,
I know at the Center for Climate Security in Washington D.C., you are also preoccupied with the chemical weapons.
Actually, we just a quick thing. We have our Council on Strategic Risks, which is the parent organization of the center. We are very concerned about.
Are you relating it right now to the war in Ukraine?
Of course, yeah. So one thing we're worried about quite a bit, and now there's recent potential evidence of a chemical weapon, of chemical warfare having been committed. So there's some reporting on it that has to be verified. But we've been worried, and our colleagues, Andy Weber, Christine Parthamore, Young Bilim, that work in our Nolan Center on Strategic Weapons, have been concerned about Russia using chemical weapons or biological weapons for some time now. That concern started when the Russian government started promoting this misinformation, which is just a blatant lie. I mean, we say misinformation is almost a euphemism, I think, at this point, which is the Russian government just lies, just makes things up, but in a very dangerous way. For about a month now, they've been talking about how, or more, Ukraine and the U.S. are allegedly building biological weapons within Ukraine. Now, this was a big red flag. The reason that they were about to use these weapons, and they were laying the groundwork of misinformation so that they could just blame the other side. It's a classic Russian tactic, is say that your opposition or your adversaries are doing something or are going to do something because Russia's going to do it. They did this with Syria, and the use of Assad used chemical weapons against a civilian population within Syria, and claimed that the rebels, that their opposition to Assad did it, and Russia helped them do that information-wise before even these chemical weapons were used. And now there's overwhelming evidence that Assad did use chemical weapons, and so we saw the same language coming out of Russia about this in Ukraine. Now the scary thing was on the biological weapons as well, because there's a concern that Russia has been using chemical weapons for a long time, also on a personal level, right, with polonium and Novichok, basically assassinating people with a chemical agent.
On the territory of other states.
On the territory of other states, including the United Kingdom, right? So, exactly. So we already know that they do this. Now, they don't just talk about doing it; they do it. They help their allies, like Assad, do it in Syria, and now they're talking about the fact that their enemies are doing are using or developing biological weapons in Ukraine. That's scary, because there's a potential that the Russian government could be planning to use a biological agent within Russia, whether it's anthrax or something else. I mean, not within Ukraine. And that's very dangerous, obviously, to the Ukrainian public that would be affected. Also, by the way, potentially Russian, soldiers who are on the ground, but also potentially for the region and the globe. What if, Russia decides to do this in a very significant way? What will that mean? What will happen to this biological agent? Will it go, beyond Ukraine and outside of Europe? And so this is something that we have to be worried about, but and we have to figure out ways of preventing it from happening. And I think the U.S. government has been doing the right thing in publishing openly, their intelligence on this, right? So something that used to take forever to declassify or whatever, the U.S. government has been doing this from early on. But as soon as they get some intelligence that the Russian government is thinking about or talking about the potential use of a biological or chemical agent, the U.S. intelligence community is releasing this information to get ahead of Putin so that he can't make these false arguments, right? And so I think that's the best that can be done right now, is keep doing that. And hopefully we can prevent that kind of a disaster. But it's scary because, if Putin sees himself against a wall, including in terms of, the military campaign, what is he willing to do? And that's it's an open question. Is he willing to use chemical agent, biological weapon, a low-yield nuclear weapon? I don't know. We don't know this, but he's been threatening these things. And so we can't let that kind of fear debilitate, what the West and NATO has been doing to support the Ukrainians. And I don't think it is. I think we need to keep supporting them with lethal aid and all kinds of aid. But we need to watch out for this potential. And the best thing we can do now is release this information as quickly as possible. And the Council on Strategic Risks, our team has been constantly on the airwaves, not just in the U.S., but also here in Europe and also in Indian media, where there's a lot of Russian disinformation happening, and in different media markets, calling out this misinformation from Russia and also warning that Russia could potentially use these kinds of weapons before they do so in an attempt to actually hopefully prevent them from doing so. So I think it's really critically important work.
Okay, thank you so much. Before we close, I want to recommend a position paper that you guys published at mid-March, right?
Yep.
It's called Climate, Ecological Security and the Ukraine Crisis, 4 Issues to Consider. And these are the issues that you consider. It's the need to accelerate the clean energy transition, the degradation of Ukrainian ecological security, decreasing global food security, we talked about it, really interesting, and of course Russia's own climate security vulnerabilities. And the authors are Erin Sikorsky, your director, right?
Yep.
Elsa Barron and Brigitte Hugh.
That's right. Brigitte. You got it right the first time.
All right. She's a German pronunciation. Very good. Also, I have to thank you and your wife, Caitlin Werrell, for the amazing study that you did in 2014 about Syria. And because it's really a personal note here, I used it in 2 universities, it was like a course material. And I also kind of applied it, because I applied interviews in the Budapest Keleti train station in 2014 when the wave of migrants was hitting Europe, and I had a couple of interviews with Syrians.
With Syrians, yeah.
And it checked out.
Yeah.
It checked out literally with everybody. I mean, I'm not saying that I interviewed 1,000 people,
right,
but a few. But it did check out. I even verified stuff that they were saying. So I'm not gonna give it any qualitative value to what I did, but it was there were migrants from Al-Bab, for example, which was bombed with barrel bombs, and they escaped, and everything that I was checking from what those people were saying was actually true. At least in terms of background information.
Yeah.
They weren't inventing stuff. They weren't making up stories.
No.
And well, that's I was impressed with that.
Thank you.
I mean, for the very truth of it, although it's an utterly tragic situation.
Yeah, well, we're glad that it had some practical value, and I think it's important now to keep doing that kind of research, to basically to foresee potential problems in the future. I mean, what we focus on is anticipating future security risks as much as possible, because there's always a kind of a, I'd say maybe a tendency even in the think tank community to sort of feed into like sort of what's already happening and what the consensus is around what's happening. But I think the most important thing we can do is try to foresee what the next crisis is going to be, and so that's what we try to do as much as possible. So hopefully we'll have fewer crises in the future, but climate change is going to make that difficult.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Frank.
Thank you, Raul.